Okay, hello everybody. Ooh, that's loud. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We're each just going to do our own separate presentations in order, so we'll introduce ourselves as we go. My name is Melissa Belvadi, and I am a librarian at the University of Prince Edward Island. I'm going to be talking on the theme of more is better about different kinds of ebook accesses, but I'm going to be focused primarily on EBA programs. First, a quick institutional context to make sense of some of the things I say. University of Prince Edward Island is a small public university in Atlantic Canada, about 4,200 FTE. Our library budget is just about $1 million US equivalent. Our ILS is evergreen, and our collections are about 300,000 print books, and now about 400,000 ebooks if you count all of the subscription, et cetera. We've been obviously firm ordering ebooks for a very long time. We subscribe to the two biggest ProQuest and EBSCO academic packages. We've been doing DDA for about 5 years, and we're now in our second year of multiple EBA programs. So first of all, how many of you are currently in one or more EBA program cycles? Okay, and those of you who said that, how many of you are in your second year or later, and you've already done one spend-out cycle? Just a couple of people, okay. So briefly to explain, the concept of EBA, evidence-based acquisition, is that you start a 12-month cycle, usually with a publisher, and you give them a fixed amount of money that you negotiate ahead of time, a pot of money that's a deposit, and you negotiate how many of their books you get access to for the entire year in exchange for that deposit. And the retail value of those books is going to be a lot more than the deposit, but how much more is your negotiation? And then at the end of the year, you'll have collected usage data on the entire collection, and you'll then spend out that deposit based on, intended primarily based on usage, but the librarians get to ultimately control which books you buy. So that's the principle, and then at the end of that cycle, you decide whether you want to give that publisher yet another deposit and go another round for another 12 months. Now, why EBA exists and why you might want to do it. From the publisher's perspective, my understanding is that this was a response to the incredible instability in revenue that the publishers experienced after their experiments with DDA. And many of the biggest scholarly book publishers pulled out of DDA and switched to this new model because by giving them a fixed deposit at the beginning of the cycle, they know exactly how much revenue they're going to get. And realistically speaking, the marginal cost to them of how many times your patrons actually use the ebooks is negligible. So they're more concerned about the fixed revenue than the amount of use, within fairness. From the library's perspective, from a small library's perspective, I would say DDA is far preferable to us. It definitely, despite the instability, is a much better deal for us, but we don't have a choice. The big publishers pulled out of DDA, and so our next best choice is EBA. It's much better than firm ordering and just-in-case purchasing, which we just can't afford anymore. So my two biggest takeaways from this is I have two really huge concerns based on, we've gone through one spend-out cycle, we're now into our second year. So taking into account, yes, we're still doing this as you hear what my concerns are. First, from the library's perspective, I want to take a moment to reflect on the fact that I think we all assume in our profession that our institutions have some kind of long-term stability in subject demand, subject relevance of monographs, whether that be through the curriculum, the faculty research. We would never be buying books if we didn't think that we could buy books that will be used this year and 10 years from now. So we have some expectation of relevant stability of a collection. So here's what's happening with EBA is any given publisher is going to have a portfolio, a stable of books, some of which are going to be relevant to our particular institution's research needs and some aren't. What we're doing with EBA is we give them, I'm going to use small library, $10,000. We give them $10,000. At the end of the cycle, we take that $10,000 and we buy from that publisher the books that got used the most in that year. It's like if you picture a counter report sorted by highest to lowest use, and you think in terms of the metaphor of the long tail, we're cutting the head off the beast. We're taking the best ones relative to our relevance to our programs, and we now own them. So then you start up the second year, and you've just cut off the head. The publisher wants the same or perhaps even 5% more money in the second year, but you've just already chopped off the best books. Now you're down to the second best books for the same amount of money. Now the publisher has new books in the next year, and that helps a little bit. But what I see happening already is 4, 5, 6 years out, we're going to find as librarians that fewer and fewer of the books that are left are of relevance to our programs, while meantime the publisher still wants the same $10,000 every single year for less and less relevance books. So I think we're going to have some difficulty negotiating this in the long term with the publishers, and I think in the long run this isn't going to be sustainable. My philosophy right now is it's useful to us for the next few years, we'll do it for the next few years until we see ourselves no longer finding it useful. The second concern is bigger than just my library's interests, and that is, are we about to do to the scholarly book market what we did to the scholarly journal market 20 years ago with the big deals? Are we, I watched this happen with our own monograph budget. We have now locked up something on the order of 30 to 50% of our entire monograph budget with 6 publishers. And what is that doing to all the other monograph publishers whom we might have spent money with and can't? That's exactly what we did with the big deals in the journals, right? So as a small library, I can't make decisions year to year based on these broad principles, but I think we as a profession need to be having that conversation. And before we go too far down that road, let's understand that, and let's talk about what we can do to ameliorate that. And I want to mention 2 EBA programs in particular that are helping with that. Project Muse and JSTOR are the 2 that I know of that we're involved with that aren't a single publisher, that are representing a large swath of university presses and are helping with that. And to me, the solution to this is to try to get more aggregators of different kinds to help pull together EBAs that represent lots and lots of smaller publishers. But until we see more solutions like that, we need to be paying attention to what are we doing to the monograph market. Okay, this is literally what happened. So 6 vendors. I'm going to start with the first 3 that we considered very successful. Number of titles. This grid represents a number of titles in the deal. How many of them were used 1 or more times, and you can see for a little institution, you're looking at between 1% and 2% were touched at all. Even far less than that were touched 10 or more times in 12 months. Other access means that same book that was used 1 or more times, we also had somewhere else, and that almost always meant the 2 big subscription packages. And then the spend count is how many books we bought for our deposit. And the lowest use is going down that spend out report. How far down in the usage did we have to go to fully spend out our money? So in the case of the first one, we ended up buying some books that only had 1 use to fully spend out our deposit. And that was because so many of the higher use ones we had access to through the subscription, so we didn't want to spend the money on them. So vendors 1 and 2, we renewed on the same terms. Vendor 3 was slightly better in terms of the lowest use spend, and also renewed on the same terms for a bit more titles. Then there were vendors 4, 5, and 6, and these were I would call them complete disasters, except all 3 vendors, when they looked at the results, were reasonable in the renewal cycle. These were vendors who didn't really understand what was going to happen to a small library situation and gave us far too few books for our deposit. In the case of the vendor number 4, what happened was, and this is true of many of the vendors, will let you actually use your BR3 counter turnaway data and buy any books that they have, not just the ones that were in your EBA program. So vendor number 4, we ended up buying like over half the books we bought were from BR3 turnaway data, not from the EBA program. So we decided, because of that, and there were so many that we got, that we renewed for giving them the same amount of money again for the next year, but they expanded from 200 books to 20,000 because they saw what was happening. Something similar happened with vendor 5. In this case, we didn't even spend out. We rolled over the entire initial deposit plus added some, not the same amount again, but some additional money, expanded to 16,000 books because, again, they saw this data and they said, oh yeah, this was not good. And the last one, they had a completely unrealistic expectation. They had what they called the 3x multiplier in value, the retail value of the books versus our deposit. I had actually negotiated to put a rollover clause in the contract just in case this happened. So that if you're a small library, do that, because it wasn't built into the contract, and you want to make sure that if this kind of result, 3 books used, you don't end up being forced to buy books that have 0 uses. So again, we rolled over the full, according to that special contract term, we rolled over the full amount with no additional funds for another year and expanded the access. So more is better for acquisitions, more is better for patrons, but for cataloging, this stuff is a nightmare. The MARC record overlaps between all these different purchase models, most especially the DDA, and the monthly updates from all these different vendors, and the subscriptions and the DDA updates and everything is just driving our people crazy. And our people, by the way, is less than 1 FTE cataloger and 1 FTE cataloging technician. And we use Evergreen, which is not a really good software system for doing lots of big batch MARC record updates. So we finally decided we had to stop being perfectionistic about never letting a DDA book trigger that we could possibly have had some other way for free, and just say that's going to be part of the cost of doing business. So we've had a few of those happen. And our head of cataloging is also our systems librarian. She wrote some local software to work with our Evergreen system to help us sort out the MARC records and the overlap and which records we load and which ones we don't according to this matrix. The biggest thing I want to point out from this matrix, first of all the vendors, if you have both subscription and DDA or both subscription and EBA on this, or purchase or whatever, on the same platform, they get that right. You'll never get a DDA triggered if you also have subscription on the same platform. So the problem is across different platforms. And the most difficult part was the EBA spend out analysis when you had the same book across multiple platforms and different purchase models. Most of the vendors I found could not give us the usage report for the EBA spend out purely in the EBA. So for instance, we might own the book on that platform, even within their own platform. They'd mix together the usage of the books we had owned outright with the EBA ones. And of course, none of them could do it across when we had the book in another platform. So that was a huge amount of work, making sure to carefully spend out each one so that we didn't, duplicate our purchases against other things that we'd have. So that's it. I'm going to turn it over to Stu.
Good morning. My name is Stu MacLehose. I'm the Digital Services and Systems Librarian. It's a relatively new title, so I had to stop and think about it. At the University of New England. And I'm going to talk to you about our experiences with various DDA programs and the loan programs that are associated with those. A little bit about UNE. We have 2 campuses. They're 20 miles apart in Maine, both on the coast, one in Portland, one in Biddeford. We have 6 different colleges. You can see them listed up here. They're primarily health sciences. We have full-time equivalent of over 6,500 students, and more than half of those students are off campus at any time, either as an online student or in a clinical rotation. So because of that, we've had a high demand for electronic resources for the entire 19 years I've been with the institution. But prior to 2012, we used 2 models of ebook acquisitions, either subscriptions or just firm order purchases. And then in 2012, we began a demand-driven acquisitions program. This made sense to us. While we thought we knew what our patrons wanted, this would show us exactly what they wanted, obviously within the limits of the profile. But the profile itself had very few filters. Visibility was set to show all titles, regardless of subject, provided the purchase price was under $400. It was a conventional DDA program. When a title was triggered, it was purchased, and we quickly found that we ran out of the allocated money, which, no surprise. But we also noticed that some of the triggered titles were used the one time to trigger, and then trigger the purchase, then they weren't ever used again. So then in 2013, we began another DDA program, and this time was with eBrary. And we added one additional component, which was short-term loans. And we set up our short-term loan, short-term loans, first off, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that when a title was triggered, it generated, in our case, a 1-day loan for 10% of the purchase price. When a title triggered for the 4th time, we set it up to purchase the title. So this means we would pay 130% of the list price, but we knew that title was used at least 4 times because we'd noticed this problem with titles being used once and never again, the traditional or conventional DDA. And this worked well for us. But then we noticed some disturbing trends that actually Melissa was talking about too. And we noticed that publishers were either pulling out of the STL, the short-term loan program, or they began increasing their price from 10% to sometimes as much as 40%. And this meant that we could be paying as much as up to 220% of the list price for a single user. And another perspective, and a one-day loan was costing almost half the purchase price. So, and aside from pulling their titles out, some publishers began just including their backlist, taking their front list out. So at this rate, the short-term loan model could become quickly unsustainable and or restrictive. And at the same time, oops, come on now. Oops, what's happening here? Are we locked up? Oh, the clicker? Yeah, try that. What is happening?
Quickly take it out of full screen. Sorry.
Exactly. I mean, I could just talk to you, that would be, without the visuals, right?
What happened?
Oh, thank you. So we'll just keep it like this, that's fine. Yeah. All right. So at the same time this was happening, we were transitioning from eBrary to eBook Central, and eBook Central was introducing a new loan model called Access to Own. And Access to Own is an exclusive agreement between eBook Central and participating publishers, which allows access to all the titles in the publisher's catalog. The loan prices paid are credited towards the purchase price, and once loans exceed 100% of the purchase price, the title is purchased. And the pricing structure breaks titles down into front list and back list. So for front list titles, a one-day loan trigger is charged at 55% of the purchase price. So by the time of purchase, the title was used twice, and the library will have paid 110% of the purchase price. Backlist, one-day trigger is charged at 35% of the purchase price. And so that means the title is purchased on the third trigger event, and the library will pay 105% of the purchase price. So for us, given the increase in short-term loan pricing, the decision to include Access to Own was an easy one. All right, fingers crossed. All right. All right, so I've previously talked a little bit about our original eBrary profile. You can see that here alongside our current eBook Central profile. So the total number of titles included is smaller. We went from 781,000 down to 482,000, but that's because we decided to reduce the maximum purchase price from $400 to $250 to better economize. And some titles, there was overlap between Access to Own and short-term loan. We decided to default to short-term loan over Access to Own, provided the loan price was over 15%. If the loan price was 15% or less of the purchase price. And then so there are four access models available for purchase: one user, three user, nonlinear, and unlimited. Obviously, 1, 3, and unlimited are pretty self-explanatory. But for those of you not familiar with nonlinear are defined, at least for eBook Central, as having a set number of days in a year on which the title may be viewed. It's typically 325, and any number of community members that can access a title simultaneously on a day that it has been triggered. And after 12 months, the number of days available is reset. So we default to the single user model because this is the least expensive one. But if we find more demand for the title, we have extended access turned on. So this prevents turnaways by automatically allowing additional short-term loans or upgrading to the next available access model or purchase of additional copies. We've been using this for well over a year now. So we decided that now is the time to take a look at some of our results and see where we're getting with this. So when we rely heavily on cost per use stats when we're making decisions to keep or cancel any of our e-resources. And typically what a number we use is any resource with a cost per use value of over $10 is a candidate for cancellation. And so you can see from these numbers that our DDA program with eBook Central is quite safe. 67 cents was our cost per use. So to clarify, the number that I'm using here is not just the is not just the titles that were triggered, but all the available pool, all 482,000 titles that were triggered, or that were used, I should say, because not all uses triggered a purchase, or triggered was a triggered event. I'm sorry. And the same could not be said for our original DDA program, the one in 2012. There, the cost per use in that year was $35.70. And then over the course of the years from 2012 to 2017, when you take into use, post-purchase use, it does come down, but still it's $17.40, which would be above what we consider our trigger, or our cutoff for looking at cost per use. So another point is that we've had over almost 3,000 titles that were triggered but not yet purchased. And that accounts for 75% of the total triggered titles. This means that, people are getting that one use that they need. They're getting what they want. We're paying a portion of the price. That title may never be used again, but that patron got what they needed. And then, another thing that we've noticed, and which shows here, is that we've noticed a lot better post-purchase use. You can see that from this chart that the titles that we purchased first with this new program, you couldn't get any better. I mean, 100% use post-purchase. Of the 215 titles originally purchased as conventional DDA, only 41% have been used since then, and 37% were never used aside from that one time that triggered the purchase. So as you can see, post-purchase use is much higher when using some form of short-term loan. So just to reiterate, what would have been a purchase after one use with a conventional DDA program is now a short-term loan, and that will cost us between 10 and 55%. And if it's on that high end of 55%, that goes towards the purchase price as well. Purchasing this way guarantees that the title was used more than once, which makes the probability of post-purchase use even greater. So we've only compiled, I'm not sure this is all that readable, but we've only compiled full year cost per use analysis data on this hybrid program for 2017. But you can see from this graph how well the program is working. Our most economical way of providing access to eBooks is through our subscriptions. We have Academic Complete and the University Press add-on to Academic Complete, and you can see, that the cost per use for them is under 20 cents per use for those two. Firm orders was actually quite a surprise, but there were a couple titles in there that were very, very, very high use, and that that kind of accounted for that. And then while ATO cost per use is high, it's still, it's above what we're seeing from the other components of this ebook program. It's still well below that $10 per use that we would be concerned about. And it generated almost 100,000 uses that wouldn't have been there if we hadn't used it. So we now have choices when prioritizing our means of ebook acquisitions. So based on the results from the previous screen, our priority of ebook acquisition models closely follows our cost per use analysis. We start with our subscriptions. Not only are there a predictable cost each year, they also offer the best return on investment value. We follow this, but those are primarily backlist titles. We follow this with our two loan programs. Since short-term loans offer better cost per use, we prioritize these higher than access to own. Traditional DDA are our fourth priority, and then lastly are the firm orders. And once again, the firm orders are the only outlier. We had one title that we had over 4,500 uses for, and three others that had over 1,000 uses. Okay, as with any form of DDA transaction, the experience is completely seamless to the end user. They simply find what they want and click on it. It doesn't matter to them if the title is an ATO backlist with two loans already triggered or a conventional DDA. And so here you see a link, and we also have copies of it up right here, of a case study that ProQuest did on our institution. And so you're welcome to, that's a nice compliment to what I've presented here. So in conclusion, this program is working very well for us now, but just as we had to adapt when short-term loans became cost prohibitive, we realize that we'll probably have to adapt to something new in the not too distant future. So I'll pass it on to Joe now.
I'm going to risk it and go back to full screen. We'll see what happens. Okay, so my name is Joe Marciniak, and I'm from the University of West Georgia. And what I wanted to do today is share some data and analysis from a recent DDA program that we conducted there starting this past spring. And I've got about 7 months of data that I want to go through. And it's really just to let you know what happened with us, how we set up the DDA program, and all the different options that you have available now when you do something like that. So I tried to find some images. And these are all Creative Commons licenses, so we're okay. And I've had two really distinct versions of a DDA experience. My previous experience at a previous institution, DDA was very kind of new and exciting, so we would dump, hundreds of thousands of MARC records into our catalog, and it was very much, from our viewpoint, we didn't feel like we had a lot of control. I think we spent all of our money in, a matter of days. Then we were reviewing books and like, let's go see what we bought last night, And so it was exciting, but it just, from my perspective of collection development and collection assessment, I didn't really like what we ended up with, particularly when we reviewed the titles, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the image on the right is the current experience that we've had at the University of West Georgia, which is a much more controlled, very specific program, which is what I'm advocating for today. My role at West Georgia, in addition to e-resources librarianship, is collection assessment, and I've been trying to move us into the direction of purchasing eBooks the way that we used to, or still do, purchase print books, which is a much more selective, yes, we want this book, we want this in our collection, and we want to own it, rather than the large collections where titles may move in and out. I don't want us to get rid of those, but I'd like to see a little bit more of traditional acquisition models playing a part in ebook acquisition. So a successful DDA program, this is all stuff that we probably know in this room. The only caveat I have on the first one about saving time is that eventually it will save you time. It's important, from what I'll talk about in a minute, to really front load the work. You don't want to do this just to rush the process. You want to do very careful planning, setting up what they call an approval plan, so that you are happy with the results you get. Now, once you've done the front end work, then it does become very quickly and saves you a lot of time eventually. Obviously, it increases options for patrons. They see titles and resources there that you don't really own. They don't know that. They just know that they're options for them. It can make collection development easier, and it justifies spending. There's no better justification to someone who doesn't know anything about libraries other than we bought it because someone used it. One of your researchers here at the institution wanted it, so we bought it. And it ensures access to titles, which is something that I'm really into as the e-resources librarian. I'm the one that hears about it when the title that was part of that collection is now gone, and I realize that a lot of vendors are only doing deletes twice a year. But for research projects, senior seminar projects, that still poses an issue when a researcher comes back in the spring and the book that they used was part of the December delete. So the preparation is essential. So these are just some of the aspects that you're going to want to keep in mind if you're interested in trying a DDA program at your institution. You're going to want to set the license terms. Do you want short-term loans? Do you want one user, unlimited? You're going to want to be able to think about what you want to be triggered for purchase, and of course that's going to change the cost. Which aggregators do you want to include? Are there discounts for how many titles you put into your catalog or your discovery service? How well do those integrate with your discovery service or catalog? And what's the platform? Everybody might have a little bit of a different ebook platform. If they're doing it mobile, do they need to download another app to look at that ebook? And then how do you want things to be found? Do you want them cataloged, MARC records, or do you just want to do the discovery service? Which publishers, publication dates? Catalog sort order is important because if it's relevance versus publication date, if you have publication date and you put only 2018 titles in there, then they're going to go quick, because I know we like to think that users all scroll through those pages of results. There's no way they're just clicking on ones on the first page, but if that's where you have all of yours populating, they're going to get spent really, really quickly. And then content overlap. And for this one, I like to not just look at exact titles. You want to look at how well a subject is already covered by resources you have in your library. It might not be that you don't have that exact same book on the Civil War, but maybe you already feel like your collection well covers that, so that's something you're not going to want to include in the pool. So the UWG Scenario, so we partnered with Gobi, and Jessica Critton and Barnhart, they were two subject librarians at the University of West Georgia, and they worked with Katie, and they really did a lot of the hard work in terms of setting up that approval plan. They were the subject liaisons for the education department, and we only did education. So the cool thing is you can, of course, do it by subject as well. They chose the call number range LA1 to LC 6691, and even then, they went through and removed titles based on certain categories that they just didn't want included, even if they were in that call number range. This is just a couple of examples, the textbooks, and there was a school architecture and equipment subject that they didn't want, and these were based on their conversations and dealings with the education program at the University of West Georgia. They opted to include all the publishers in the beginning, only titles published within the last 3 years. We did no short-term loans. We wanted purchase on first use only, and we set it to one user license preferred as the model. If that wasn't available, the system kicked an email out to me, and then we talked about what we wanted to do. The aggregators that we selected in the beginning were EBSCO, ProQuest, Wiley, and Cambridge, and we set spending caps. Make sure that you do that, no matter what you do. A little bit about our perceived patron base. This is the College of Education statistics from 2017-2018. There's about 2,000 people in this group. We have 101 full and part-time faculty members, 833 enrolled graduate students, 1,039 undergrads with declared majors in COE. So obviously anyone at our institution, the University of West Georgia, has about 14,000 students. Anyone can trigger a purchase. We just sort of assumed that this is most of the people who are going to be looking for these titles within this call number range. So what happened? Okay, we set our initial cap at $3,000. And we did discovery only. We didn't do anything with catalog or MARC records. We didn't do any of that. So discovery was the only way you could find these books. And we added them to the catalog on March 4th, 2018, and it took 7 days to spend $3,000 and buy 21 eBooks. We then used that data to badger my boss for more money, which he gave us. Well, we did pretty good. We got about 20 days of badgering in there. And then we got $2,000 on the 30th, and we spent that in 4 days, and we bought an additional 15 books. So in just 11 days, we spent almost $5,000, and we brought 36 books for the education department, and that was an average of $138.22 per book. So again, if you've done all of that sort of front-end work on setting up the approval plan, and you get money added to an account, if you need to, if you have year-end funds, or if you have people who are taking on collection development in an area that maybe isn't their strong suit, it is a really effective way to buy titles and to buy them quickly as long as you've set up those parameters early on. So the usage, I tracked 7 months of usage from March to September of this year, and the 36 DDA titles experienced 503 successful title requests. So that's counter for BR1 report, which is the entire book request for the BR1. That's an average use of 13.97 uses per DDA ebook. Now the other ebooks that we had in this pool, there were 5,337, and I only included ones that had at least one use, to be fair with the DDA program, since those didn't show up until there was one use. There's like 240,000 that got 0 uses over the 7 months. So the pool was much larger, but there were only 5,337 outside of the DDA titles in this group, and they experienced a use of 2.65, and that is the same stat, the BR1 report. So you could turn around and you could say the DDA ebooks experienced more than 4 times usage than the non-DDA titles. We need to do this program. You know, if you were talking to someone that was able to make that happen at your institution. But when I look a little bit closer at the data, there's a couple of outliers. So 5 of the titles that were in the DDA program accounted for 348 of the uses, which is 69.18% of all usage. And so my conclusion was that these were probably or likely assigned by a professor and used in a course. But there's this knee-jerk reaction that we have to that where that somehow disqualifies the data. But it's sort of the opposite interpretation at the University of West Georgia, particularly in Georgia, where we now have a low-cost, no-cost designation for courses in our catalog. And this is actually something that makes me really happy, because we have presented to the faculty at least 3 times over this past year about using library resources and courses. So this, to me, even though, kind of depends on how you look at the data, but to me this is a really strong selling point, the fact that faculty would locate resources that we had and use them in their courses for coursework. Now, have been trying to and am reaching out to those 101 faculty members in the education department to try to confirm that, yes, these titles were used, but I don't have anything to report back on that. So this one is just an assumption of mine, but not the fact that 5 titles accounted for 348% of the use of all DDA titles. And again, that's the BR1 data. So our next steps, spending money is the easy part, but here's my biggest concern, or my biggest metric of success is what we think of the titles. When I've done DDA programs in the past, as I said, we would review the titles, and there were always some that we didn't feel like we needed to purchase or that we didn't want to purchase. So for me, this program was most successful because the library liaisons, the subject specialists looked at the titles and they were all happy with them. They were all titles that they would have made purchases on their own. Now I know that's obvious because they set up those parameters for the profile, but it still, to me, is the most successful sign, or the strongest sign of a successful program, that we didn't buy anything that we don't want, and we own them all, and they're in our catalog, so those are always available to our patrons. We want to expand it to other subjects in the future and continue analyzing the data over a period of time that's longer than 7 months. I'm going to keep tracking these 36 DDA titles so that I can see how it works over time. And then the metadata can also be used to inform collection development. And the way that, what I found was interesting is when I was looking through the subject definitions that were ascribed to these titles, there were certain ones that were popping out, like instructional design or school violence. So you can also use the subject terms associated with those purchased titles to make other decisions across your collection, maybe even with databases or journal titles. So you don't have to just use the information you get from that to buy more eBooks. It can go all around the library once you start looking at what keeps showing up, what are people using. So we just have like 2 minutes if anybody has a question. I'm not sure, but that's why I wanted to get our contact information up here. Feel free to email us, contact us if you want to look at the data. I'm happy to share ours if you have any other questions, but we do have time for 1 or 2 if anybody has something that they'd like to ask at this point. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming, and we hope that you enjoyed it. Oh yes, come grab one of the reports if you want. We've got a whole stack.